This is a conversation with Dr. Kirsten Peterson, performance psychologist and director of Dr. Kirsten Peterson Proprietary Limited. Kirsten is a renowned performance psychologist after having worked with the US Olympic team and the AIS in Canberra, Australia. In this interview, Kirsten gives us an inside look at what takes place in a performance session, the challenges an athlete faces, and the potential pitfalls that can lead to burnout and other mental health issues. She gives us a taste of her process of working through the anxiety of high performers and helping maintain well-being on the inside so that outside performance can continue. It's a fascinating look into the daily work of high performance coaches and psychologists and how similar struggles are faced by so many of us to varying degrees. Athletes are not robots, but have historically been told and expected to be immovable forces of toughness. I'm sure you'll enjoy our conversation. Hi, I'm Dr. Trevor Brown from Neurocare Academy, and thanks very much to Neurocare again for bringing this to us for free for all you guys and sponsoring this and allowing me to speak with lovely Dr. Kirsten Peterson today. How you going, Kirsten?
I'm doing great. Thanks for asking.
Excellent. So, Dr. Kirsten Peterson is a performance psychologist, director of Dr. Kirsten Peterson Proprietary Limited. And Kirsten, we met in Canberra at the AIS. You invited me to speak at a workshop regarding new developments in neuromodulation and, sport performance, where I presented my PhD work on neurofeedback and EEG with athletes. And you were very enthusiastic about learning about all that, which drew me towards you. Um, but look, before starting it at the AIS, you had worked with the US Olympic team, and that led you to then work with the AIS until 2018, I believe. And now you run your own business in performance psychology. And you've recently written the book When Grit Is Not Enough. Wow, what a journey. Is there anything I've missed there?
I think you hit all the high points. I did have a kid in there, so, we could get into all sorts of other things, but, that very well describes the trajectory of my career, which a lot of unexpected twists and turns, but here we are.
Great, great. And we'll get into that. Excellent. So, just a bit of a summary of today's interview. It's going to be a little bit different from others that I've conducted with neurostimulation experts. We've focused on different neuromodulation techniques in this interview series. I've often spoken with experts about the additive and even synergistic or possibly synergistic effects of psychotherapy plus TMS or other neurostimulation therapies. But we've mainly focused on the neurostimulation techniques, the TMS, the TDCS, the neurofeedback. I haven't really focused on the neuroplasticity that takes place during the most common technique in today's world of mental health and performance, which is counseling and coaching or talk therapy, psychotherapy goes by different names and depending on your qualification and your country. Um, so there are so many imaging articles to reference now showing that neuroplasticity or brain change actually takes place during psychotherapy. And Kirsten, you've been doing this all your life. So today we're going to talk about how you go about your work, what you find the most important and impactful aspects of working with athletes and high performance teams. Because it's not only athletes, it's high performance in general, and we're going to take a look inside at what takes place in a performance session. Perhaps even using me as the subject. Not sure. It could be a less structured conversation today. And I'm not quite sure where it's going to go, but let's just see how Kirsten. Let's see how we go.
Just like every psychotherapy session I'm ever in, it's a journey that we'll be taking together, so don't worry.
Sounds good. Okay, so to begin with, tell us a little bit about your book, When Grit's Not Enough. I remember you saying very clearly to me, um, one of the things that sort of spawned this, or what you're thinking about this and your experience through high performance coaching, is the old adage, or what you heard a lot: we break them, you fix them, is what you got a lot as the sports psychologist, and that sort of attitude that various organizations have as pushing people to the limit and then passing them over.
Yes, that was my experience, And I don't want to demonize coaches who believed that that was the way to go. I think there's a lot of ignorance that exists around how brains and minds actually work. And we're probably a marriage made in heaven, Trevor, because you could talk about the brain, I can talk about the mind, and here we go. Um, but when Grit, the book by Angela Duckworth, came out in 2014, I was a bit disillusioned, to say the least, about another word, grit, that could be weaponized against athletes. Like mental toughness was the catchphrase when I was coming through the ranks. This idea that we can become tough and we just go until we can't. And so when I saw this grit came up and it was getting traction, people are interested in it. I initially looked at it, but heard a TED talk with Angela Duckworth, and she said, "Look, we don't really know kind of how to build grit. Really, we just have these interviews with gritty people." And so I just kind of stepped away because I was like, it's not very informative. But then COVID hit at some point, and my business fell apart like so many other businesses. So what else was I going to do but write a book? Because what I had plenty of time to do it. And it was around this time, as COVID was taking control, so to speak, you watched high performance sport in particular really fall apart, because we are nothing in high performance sport, as you would know, Trevor, other than a domain that requires a lot of structure. We know when the Olympic Games are scheduled 4 years out, we periodize training. Everything's happening. Every moment is choreographed to get athletes to the best performance. But now COVID hits. Teams are sent home. Athletes are expected to figure out how to kind of run. They love it. Oh, good. I don't have the coach breathing down my neck. But it became this really interesting, and I say interesting not in a good way, experience for a lot of athletes who um, kind of developed this sense of decision fatigue. Every day I was getting up. What should I do? Should I train now? Should I train now? Should I train now? Kind of thing. And it was really hard. And I think a lot of athletes also struggled not having the very people to benchmark themselves against every day, doing this all by themselves. So there was this thing. And but what really set the stage for the book for me was two different coach stories that I ran into along the way, because I was interviewing coaches just to because I had nothing else to do. How are you doing in your world? But one coach who will go unnamed was an Australian coach who, when the Olympics, if you recall, were delayed a year, these were the Tokyo Games. So instead of Tokyo 2020, it all of a sudden became Tokyo 2021. The first time in Olympic history, there was a 5-year quadrennium, meaning the period of time between Olympics. So it had happened at a time that a lot of athletes had already been selected for the 2020 Olympic team. And I'm not talking, not just this sport I'm referencing here, but a lot of athletes then faced the prospect of having to be deselected because no Olympic team was going to carry athletes for 13 months. You get selected a month before the games. We can't guarantee that you're going to be healthy and in the same shape in a year. So then they deselected everything. But this particular coach continued to train his squad as if the games were a month away and not 13 months away, which meant no break, just keep going hard. And athletes were, in my mind, rightfully questioning, what are we doing here? Because of course, in the Olympic world, when you have an Olympic Games coming up, maybe you've delayed you have a partner and you want to have a baby. You're going to wait till after the games to start getting pregnant. So you have 3 years before the next one. Or maybe it's a wedding. But now all of a sudden here and things could really radically change for people. But this particular coach, grind, 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 grind. And ultimately, in that next 6 months, a quarter of the national team quit under this particular coach's tutelage. And so it got me thinking about this sort of uh, way. But then the other side of it, I talked to another coach, and this was a U.S. coach who I'd known from my U.S. Olympic days. Very, very successful softball coach, and collegiate world. So a little bit different environment. But I was asking him about how his team was going, and he mentioned that they had two sports psychologists for his team, which is unheard of in sports psychology world. So I'm all like, really, what are you guys working on with all this psychology support? And he's, what kind of performance things are you doing? And he just put his hand up to the camera and he said, We're not working on performance. Right now, it's all about mental health. And I was really struck by that. And what he went on to say was that the schedule had been derailed. Players didn't know what to make of themselves. So he and his staff were really made it foot forward, really talking with not only athletes, but families. And again, collegiate, so slightly different population, but nevertheless, really involving families in the decision that they were making on behalf of the athletes, trying to keep it fun, keep it light. And this was what really struck me. He has a very powerful college program. This could be a coach's dream come true because everybody's going to stay an extra year because they missed out on their senior year, and you load your team up because those seniors are going to stay and play an extra year. So now you have a lot of talent. But what he did is he said to any junior, meaning one level below senior, who was expecting to be top dog because the seniors would have graduated, but because they didn't graduate, they're still there. He offered anyone who wanted to have their moment in the sunshine as a senior a chance to transfer to another program. Like he was literally volunteering to reduce his own talent pool for the mental health of the players who this whole thing had been so crazy. If that makes sense. So it really struck me how athlete centric and mental health centric this particular person was. And you can bet your sweet bippy that these athletes, you walk over hot coals for a manager, they were walking over hot coals to this guy because of the way he was looking out for them. All that being said, I started writing this book about this idea that sometimes, particularly in times of uncertainty and change, maybe grit is not enough. There's something else going on here where you really are able to pivot into what is needed in the moment. So I start writing my book. Really, it's about mindset. What kind of mindset do we need to really radically accept reality for what it is, as opposed to what we want it to be? In times of uncertainty, it's the hardest time to do that often because our threat detecting brains want to tell us all the things that should be different. So I go through a lot of stuff in that first section. The second section of the book is around the idea of purpose being a kind of North Star during times of uncertainty. Between you and me, I think it's the weakest part of my book, but nevertheless. And then the final part is really about effort and the kind of effort we give to anything, really. And I love this idea. Yeah, that sounds so self serving. I love what I said in the book about effort, that what this really is about is bringing the least amount of effort we need for any particular challenge. But often we over grit and we believe quitting never can happen. We have to work very, very hard. And it looks like we're really putting in effort when actually the best efforts sometimes in the hardest times are the ones where we're just there. Now I think you referenced flow state earlier, and maybe we didn't talk about it yet, but this idea of just effortless being in the moment. And I think there's a lot of interesting science around the minimal effort that we need.
Yeah.
All that
Yeah.
I'll just say, all that being said, I'm like 3/4 of the way through my book when I realized Jesus, I don't know what Angela Duckworth, who wrote Grit, said about this. And maybe I should read her book because maybe she's already said everything I said. And I grudgingly, I buy the book Grit and I pick it up and I start to read it for the first time. And I love it. I don't know if you've had a chance to read the book, but it's an excellent, really thoughtful look at what people do for long-term goals that are hard. So it tells this really riveting story. But ultimately, I finished the book in a weekend and I email Angela and thank her for this and ask her if I could talk to her about this idea of overgritting. And she let me interview her, which was like somebody like that reaching out, and so we had a great talk, and basically it came out that I was off the hook because while she's interested in helping kids acquire more grit, she was really not interested and didn't even really believe there was a world where there was there was such a thing as too much. Like if that's a world, you can have it, basically. So anyway, I got a reprieve in the last moment and felt like I could break the book. Way more than you probably wanted to know, but nevertheless, there you go.
No, that's great. That's a great overview of your book, and by the way, I love the section on purpose. I thought it was great as well. So,
Oh.
um, no, but look, that's fantastic because really your niche and after the Angela Duckworth book is when constant effort. I mean, it doesn't just that isn't it. That isn't all we need. It's I've heard you say before the garden hose that you didn't turn off, right? This constant
Mhm.
effort that goes through a lot of organizations now. But sometimes it does learn to lead to burnout. Um, we break them, you fix them, and you have to fix a lot of people in that situation. Through COVID, like you mentioned, I mean, a lot of us were working very, very, very hard. A lot of, paramedics, for example, and people in health and safety, and so were working around the clock. Um, so, when's it time to do work around? Um, well-being, anxiety, fear, all that sort of stuff that comes into high performance because you can't just have grit nonstop. It'll burn you out. You'll get injured. Something will happen. It'll lead to trauma. It, and when this is your job, Kirsten, when do you have to sort this out?
Yesterday. So here's the thing, right? Like, the issue that I see that makes it hard is that for people, and I'm going to put you in this group because spoiler alert for anyone listening, Trevor is an Olympic athlete, but we'll get to that. To be great at anything, often we learn to turn off awareness of things that might get in the way of that big thing. And I see many high achievers actually dissociating in a not in a clinical sense, but kind of disengaging from what their body and brain might be telling them because it isn't in their best interest to work really hard. So we don't we learn to not pay attention to fatigue. We learn to not pay attention to niggles. Um, Although really great athletes, we'd argue, wanna pay attention to those niggles right away, but it is an acquired skill to first, like, know that when I'm doing any effort and it's hard, I have to get through that thing. But how much do we leave behind because we stop really paying attention to a lot of signals that might be important? So, the skill of self-awareness is a baseline, but it's such an interesting one to talk about the data suggests there's Tasha Eurich wrote this book, I think it was called Insight, but I'm not, I might be misquoting, um, where her research showed that 85% of us think we're self-aware, but only 15% of us really are. And that's just across the board. Never mind if in the course of going after something really hard, you've actually trained yourself to ignore signals. So my job is to help people realize that self-awareness is important and that you can live with the signal and you can learn to interpret it more wisely rather than ignoring it as a blunt instrument approach. The idea of noticing what it's telling me, where, say, if there's something going on in my body, where am I feeling it? What actually is happening, minus the story we are telling ourselves about it. Because often, you feel a niggle. It's like, oh my God, this means X, Y, Z. When really, it's just a niggle. Maybe 2 days before you have to hit that Olympic final, you have a niggle. But if you blow it up into something bigger, then suddenly it becomes a big performance detractor. So s it's not an easy question that you asked, Trevor, but it's an important one in the sense that because you used words like and, these words are triggering in and of themselves for many performers, like trauma. And that's kind of we're gonna set that aside for right now, but let's just know that trauma is much more common than we know in amongst the people we are, who we are and the people we live with. But fear is a very natural and present day emotion. One of the first emotions we ever experienced is as we evolved to be Homo sapiens. And yet, oh boy, fear. How many athletes do both of us know who fear? Like fear is uncomfortable, so we fear it. Or anger. Anger can feel energizing, but it has to be managed skillfully, because it can take over. And so it is really at the end of the day, self-awareness allows us to see things, but we have to cultivate it so that we see things as they are, not for um as accurately as possible and as soon as possible. Because look, for example, particularly with anger, and I'm sorry I'm really going on. I take a long time to answer a question. With anger in particular, if you can see it early, you can catch it before it takes over. But once it's there, we are marionetted by our anger in ways that aren't, it's the stupid thing you say that ruins the next 48 hours of your marriage. We want to catch the anger before it gets to where we do something stupid. But all that being said, does that make sense? So it's to know accurately what's happening. So then we can start to work with it, not be
Yeah.
owned by it.
Yeah, look, absolutely, it makes sense, Kirsten, and that self-awareness, and I obviously it's not an absolute. It's not a you either have it or you don't. It's a lot of it's situational. It's dynamic. Do you have self-awareness at a particular moment before the event, or during the event, or after the event, or when you're reflecting with your coach? Do you have that self-awareness, and you working with athletes um, to try to promote that self-awareness at different moments all have their intricacies. So it's such a difficult question to answer that I just asked you. And you know,
Well, let me
when
can I
does
just say one thing in there too is
Mm.
self-awareness can be trained. And that would be the thing that but we train it. It's just like anything else, a basic skill, hitting a forehand, say in table tennis, it's one of the basics and you hit it a million times so that you can hit it well when the pressure's on. The idea of self-awareness development is to be able to sit even with doing nothing. This is where like meditation is one of the greatest brain training skills there is right now available to us in the sense of being able to sit and start to notice the landscape of the mind is one of the cheap. You don't need any equipment, but it's one of like I find I've never met an athlete or human who says, I can't wait to sit down and just pay attention to the quote unquote shit show that lays between my ears. You're kidding me. And yet this is the way for us to develop it. So it's simple but not easy. So I just wanted to put that in there before you went further.
Absolutely. It's so important, and to try to explain that to an 18-year-old who's, top 5 in the world or something, that they need to sit down and be self-aware, right? That's a totally different skill, than it would be to, a seasoned athlete who's 30 or 35.
Yeah.
Um, and, you know, these these processes that you're going through with athletes, making them self-aware, this is creating brain change, right?
Mhm.
And different triggering aspects of the environment, different trauma that they've had, can sometimes can sometimes impact the ability to work through something and create that brain change. And so we've spoken a lot in this interview series about neurostimulation being the impetus to disrupt the circuitry so that we can then work through these things, which is what then you were doing. Um, I'll give an example, a very simple example from my career. There were certain people that, particularly emotionally, people that would trigger you. Um, if
Mhm.
if it's outside the venue of the sporting venue, they wouldn't trigger me. But if they were there when I was hitting a simple forehand in a warm up and were sitting down watching my match, maybe they would trigger me. And so it's situational as well. And to try to make athletes self aware of these triggers that's increase fear, that increase anxiety. It's pretty tough, Kirsten.
And I want to be careful. Trauma is kind of a subset of experience. And just so for listeners who might not be familiar with what we're talking about, um, trauma is witnessing or being part of an event that is so out of the pale and this is specific to the person, such that one person might just skate through something. Frontline providers, having seen a lot of, injury and things, may have learned to not be traumatized by seeing somebody who comes in with a head wound. But for each one of us, there's something that there's a threshold that we might hit based on what we experience. Whether it's, seeing an accident, seeing somebody dies. But I could argue, although I didn't believe it as a sports psychologist, I believe it now, that we can be traumatized by a big event that goes horribly wrong, and not in the sense that we get injured, but something that it just is outside the realm of our expectations. And you had asked before, like, how do we know if an athlete has been traumatized? And I generally find that they either know something happened to them and they haven't allowed themselves to think about it. Maybe it was the terrible loss, or maybe, whatever it was, and they just like, "Nope, it happened, and I don't really pay attention." But maybe equally, what do I wanna say here? So they can have it where it feels walled off, but something's not right. There are things that they just won't allow themselves to talk about. They know that there's something going on, or it actually is, like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. People would experience intrusive nightmares, or if things come back, like, out of the blue, that just remind them of things, or they get triggered. I think that was the word you used, maybe by certain people in certain environments, give me this involuntary reaction. All of these to be said, and this is a very light touch on what trauma is, but only that it's more prevalent than we know. And your point earlier about it is that when we have situations in our lives that we either know we're walling off, or we know own us in some way, because we excuse me, we react in ways that are uncharacteristic of us. It is like having the garden hose. I think that was the expression, the garden hose running in our minds. Meaning it's just like if you left a garden hose out in your backyard and it slowly floods away, you're wasting a ton of water. Undealt with trauma motors away in the background of our subconscious and steals away our bandwidth for really optimal performance. So it is in our best interest to, if we know that we're walling off, or we know there's a situation we haven't come to terms with, it's worth it. If you want to be at your best in a given situation, you want to be a more fully functional human being, it is absolutely worth getting help for that. Um, and so if I hear an athlete talking to this, we will spend some time creating a safe place and time, and to talk through what has happened and what's going on for them, so they can remake sense for it. Because it's almost like in a traumatic situation, your brain doesn't know what to do with that experience in terms of a memory, and it files it in a way that's just not right. We used to talk about floppy disks going in the wrong way, but I don't even know if people know what floppy disks are anymore. And so it's really finding ways, and I'm not saying talk therapy is the only way. There are other therapeutic modalities that can help us reintegrate trauma into our experience so that we can go on more fully function. Another big piece of business there. If there's anything you want to unpack in what I said,
Really,
great.
really good. Look, we know from EEG research, without getting too technical, that there's not much of a relaxation state that comes in trauma patients, and it's a very, very typical EEG brainwave state. That's fast wave, high frequency, low voltage EEG, and that's very typical of people who have had the hose running constantly for a long time, because they're constantly vigilant of the triggering events that elicit this trauma. And so that takes effort, it takes energy, and it leads to burnout a lot of the time. And to try to manage that and help people become self aware is such a challenge. Kirsten, but you're up to the task because you even had a little bit of your own burnout experience. Can you tell us very quickly about that?
Yeah, and I want to be careful here too because I don't think my burnout was as a result of trauma. My burnout though was a catastrophic result of a complete lack of self-awareness. I had worked at what many and I myself described as the dream job as a senior sports psychologist at the US Olympic Committee. But it was a job acquired pretty much out of grad school. So I went from zero to hero in my career. And I wouldn't recommend that in hindsight, only because it was, for the first 5 or 6 years, I was massive imposter syndrome, working by incredible colleagues who so it wasn't even like I wasn't supported, but I didn't even know how to, the shame of me feeling like I didn't belong. I couldn't say that to anybody. At least I didn't think I could. Maybe it was a form of emotional trauma. I don't want to overpaint it. But after I was there 14 years, and just by the end, I realized I was kind of phoning it in. Like I had just stopped being interested in growing. I was just coming to work. And ironically, I had was thumbing through a book that I had contributed a chapter to, and performance psychology in action or something like that. And my chapter was overtraining and burnout was what I had written, uh, for helping other practitioners help athletes who might be experiencing this. And I had a handy self-assessment at the end of the chapter, 10 questions to determine if burnout's in the room. And I'm reading this and I'm like, tick, tick. And I'm reading about a chapter going, shoot, this is what I'm experiencing. I am just kind of emotionally done. Um, and I really don't know. I couldn't point to what the disconnect came from. But I think it was an expensive way of doing business is trying to pretend I was doing a great job when actually I didn't feel like I was, maybe. But anyway, all that being said, that led me to quit. I just knew what I was doing was not serving me. For 14 years to develop that self-awareness. Thank you very much. And yeah, and in another probably ill-considered career move, the AIS was looking for a head of performance psychology at the time. And hit me up pretty quickly because they heard I was unemployed. And I probably took the job 6 months too soon. But even in just the change of environment, I was reinvigorated in my career for the next 7 years. So something happened there. But anyway, hilariously, the sports psychologist was the last one to realize she was burned out.
Right. Well, look, you've had to deal with that yourself, over a long period of time, and had to help others deal with it as well. You've had to help other people deal with not only burnout, not only with a constant effort at success, but also the anxiety that goes along with the constant having to step up to perform.
I'll just say, so, it's interesting you raise the concept of anxiety, Trevor, because I think it's the number one question on my intake form. Like, is there performance anxiety? Generally, people who have no anxiety about performance, but get nervous about or about training, perhaps. I never see that. I see people who are cool with training and they get nervous when the consequences are high. And it's common, but it's also completely understandable. If consequently the idea of performance being an uncertainty and performance in front of people and whose consequences matter all add up to an understanding, like, it is the rare athlete actually who isn't at least a little bit anxious, but the question is what we do with that and how do we work with it. um I'd be curious, you brought this up, Trevor, as a former elite athlete. What was your experience with anxiety as a in the Olympic world? Can you talk a little bit to your own experience?
Yeah, well, I was extremely nervous before all competitions, and had a lot of success very young. I was the best in the country very young, had a lot of success, and then a lot of success, and then didn't and wouldn't accept losing, wouldn't accept failure until I was starting to lose to adults. Um, so it was, I guess there was the fear of failure there for me, for sure, but just on the pressure that I put on myself. It wasn't from anybody else.
So, but yeah, just so listeners can understand what it would be like if I were working with you. The question I have is when an athlete comes to me and or any performer and says, "I have anxiety." The first question I have is, "How do you know? How did you know?" Because, and I'm imagining you start young, you're playing young, it's fun. You're playing against adults. There's no pressure on you to do anything more than just show up and play. When did you first notice anxiety and how did you experience it?
I experienced it in a very visceral way. I felt it in my stomach. I had the heartbeat that went along with it, the sweaty palms, so all of the physical symptoms of it. But a day or two out of the competition, I'd start to think of it, start to get the butterflies in the stomach. Um, I'd start to think about excuses. I would have little niggles that popped up, or get a little runny nose and think, "Oh, I'm not up, I'm not at peak performance, or perhaps it's not that bad if I lose," or yeah, give myself little
Mm,
excuses mentally to try to cope with that as
mm,
well. I'm talking when I'm 12, 13, 14 years old, and then your coping mechanisms evolve after that. But when I was really young and just playing against kids my age, that's what I would do.
So it was, you were nervous even that young, like you felt unpleasant sensations. Because sometimes we're in the younger athletes who don't really even their brains aren't fully formed enough to appreciate there's consequences at the end of it, and they get so involved that they don't feel it. But you were kind of ahead of your time. You were noticing fear, because anxiety is really a close cousin of fear. And then you, like you said, you've had some coping strategies that you evolved, and it sounds like fear or anxiety stayed with you throughout your athletic career. Is that fair?
Yeah, definitely, because I continually put goals in front of myself at a very young age. When I saw at the age of 12 that Sydney were going to have the Olympic Games, that was a goal for me. I thought, beauty, I'm going to be 20 or 21 years old at the time of the games,
Mm.
and that's my goal. This is what I need to do. I had coaches, I had experience with the Victorian Institute of Sport, who were setting short, medium, long term goals very early, and I felt the pressure.
And what would be what were your evolving strategies to deal with that?
Well, I started to work with a coach that started to look at meditation and breathing strategies like you were talking about before. So at the age of 15, 16, 17, I was playing sort of national, junior finals and things like that, and starting to really use the coping strategies of breathing, visualization, and meditation. And that was is helping me muscle contraction, decontraction strategies.
So yeah, say a little to visualization. Just what would you visualize?
I was um I was visualizing myself playing well against a certain opponent, preparing against them, preparing tactically. I'd visualize myself in a bubble of light, of blue light and energy, and nothing could come into that bubble. So I was sort of protecting myself against anything that could come in, and also having this feeling of energy that I tried to put myself. Then I'd have strategies where I was on the court in between point routines, where I'd reflect very quickly upon the previous point, check my energy level, my activation level, see if I need to pump myself up a little bit, and then think very quickly to the tactics of the next point. What serve am I going to do? What serve may my opponent do now, and etc. Yeah.
Well, just for anyone not sort of conversant in sports psychology, I'm loving how you filled your mind with doing it right and really occupied it with things that I would describe as being your job in the moment. And what you're not saying was it, or what you're not talking about are all the things that a lot of athletes would be thinking about in that moment, which is like, oh my gosh, this guy is really strong. How am I going to manage it? So rather than injected questions, you really went with statements and you went with just keeping your mind very focused on track. So I'm loving in hindsight, I wished I'd known you back then. But nevertheless, we get to crop now.
From talking to other athletes, they perceived me as being very in control, right? That's
Mhm.
not what's going on the inside. So probably due to me acknowledging that I had such an anxiety problem, I knew I had to
Mm,
do something about it, and so I focused
mm,
very heavily on it. And I tried to stay in the here and now, yes, and I tried to fill my mind with things that I knew could keep me on track,
yeah.
because otherwise the anxiety would get the better of me, and I'd tense up and you know uh, overthink points, and that did happen, right? It did
Mm.
happen all the time, and you're never perfect. But the anxiety definitely took hold of me in those different ways.
So let's fast forward to Sydney and want to talk about what happened there.
This has turned into a nice little counseling. This is an insight to everybody about how Kirsten Peterson goes about her work. It's great. And I'm the guinea pig. Love it. So fast forward to Sydney. I'd worked for 8 years nonstop with that sort of goal in mind. That was
Mm,
sort of the end goal. I'd spent 4 years overseas in Europe as a very young, you know, kid, really, 15 years old over to Poland, 16 in Sweden, and was in France when I was 18, 19. Um, so I'd spent a lot of time by myself with this one goal, and really overthought it. Um, Probably the competition came a little bit too early for me. I worked really, really hard in that. I played the European season from September to May, and then I'd come back to Australia and play the Australian competitions from May to September in the Australian season. And it was winter, 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 for
yeah.
for 4 or 5 years, plus, no recovery time and no
This is
so
gonna say it doesn't sound like you got much of a break at all. And granted, you were in your teens when we are our most durable, but wow. And again, the emotional toll of that too, being away from home for so long.
exactly, I was very lonely over there and, learning different cultures, languages, and that, takes a certain energy as well. With new experiences as we know it, it consumes a lot of, mental effort. So there was definitely a lot of learning going on in all sorts of different ways, in different countries, and but I didn't allow myself much enjoyment, much downtime as well. It was my fault. For me, I was very disciplined, and I would push myself to the limit, and so it was my own fault. And so I got a back injury, about 9 months out from the Olympic qualifications for Sydney, and that obviously hampered my whole competitive season in Europe, plus my training and preparation. But I simply wasn't good enough. I think I was sixth or something in Australia at the time, and they took three. So I didn't perform up to scratch, up to my highest potential during the qualifications for sure. And if I had, I would have been pushing those top guys, and I wanted to give myself that chance, but I didn't with the preparation that I had.
And all I want to say is nobody wakes up, even you, going, I can't wait to screw this up today. Like I can only appreciate what it would be like to have an 8-year goal and going at it as hard as you did and it not working out, and so I hope all your listeners are listening with compassion for you as a teenager facing up to this, recognizing that, yeah, you could say it was your fault and that you were the major player. Um, but I'm gonna give you a reprieve in thinking that you did everything that you thought you could. And I don't even think recovery really was an advanced science the way it is now. Like when I was coming through sports psychology, we didn't talk about recovery. We called what you probably experienced overtraining, where you train too hard and but no athlete ever wants to hear that they're overtrained because what am I supposed to do? Do less? But now with the whole recovery science behind us, and there were recovery centers everywhere. Now we can talk about under recovered, and suddenly you can do, hit recovery harder. But I ask you, like, it's not just your responsibility, but the whole sports system back then was also not very conducive to helping athletes recognize the value of recovery. So I'm just going to throw that out there that I I would, if I could speak back to the 20-year old you and give you like a little reprieve. You didn't know what you didn't know back then. But anyway, I know, like, so all right, so we're sitting on the cusp of this, what I would guess is a devastating feeling of not reaching a goal. And how did you come back from that?
Yeah, look, it was hard. It was definitely hard, and there are definitely thoughts of, do I want to continue playing the sport? I came back to Australia for the Olympic qualifications, and saw a lot of my friends who were out on the beach and having a normal life and about to go to university, and Australian life's pretty good, right? And I was over there um, in sometimes some pretty sort of sobering living conditions, which I thought was toughening me up, of course, right? Grit and all that. Um, but before the Olympic qualifications, I'd actually signed a contract to go back to France to play for a team. And so I played the Olympic qualifications, didn't do well, and had to consider, okay, now I have to jump back on a plane and get back to France. And I'm in the what's called INSET, which is the AIS
Mm,
equivalent in Paris.
yeah.
Was accepted there to play with the top French players, and it was is an amazing opportunity. So, do I take this amazing opportunity? Um, I'd signed a contract. I'm a relatively loyal person, and this team was counting on me to come and play for their team. So I jumped back on that plane, and still with my back injury, and playing through the pain. So it wasn't fun. It wasn't a fun first 3 or 4 months in France as it got to -5 and started snowing. And it was a tough period for sure. But I did what I always did, and gritted it out. But I think it led to burnouts, and it led to injuries. How did I? I had, amazingly mentally, I had the support, right, from family, from friends, and that helped me, get through it. Table tennis wasn't the be all and end all of my life, fortunately, so that helped me tough it out. Yeah.
I love this notion for anyone when we think about how do we come through tough times, the idea of support of other people. Like we are social animals, and this notion of, and I talk to athletes like we should have three different types of social support in our lives. And if you don't have one of the three, let's get yourself some. And one is like the unconditional positive support, the the person who loves you no matter what, and that there's a safe place for you to come back to. Um, I quickly tell the story about American diver Grace Louganis, who was a perennial gold medal favorite, but a closeted gay man back when it wasn't okay to be open. Also HIV positive, and didn't. Nobody knew about that either because that was obviously a stigmatizing condition. And in Olympic qualifications, he actually hit his head on the diving board doing a reverse move dive, and then had to front back up to for the final dive to actually, it was at the Olympics. I'm sorry, I always said it was cool, and at the Olympics, and dove and won the gold medal. And when they asked him afterwards, after all that had happened at that Olympics, "What were you thinking about before your gold medal dive?" He said, "That no matter what happens, my parents should still love me." And that, like, if we're coming to a place in the discussions of between all the emotions we're talking about and what I really think fuels excellent optimal performance, it's that feeling of safety. We want to strive for safety over fear. And so the idea that you somehow got you through this really tough period was the love and support of family. But I'll just say,
Well, that definitely had that safety.
yeah, God, how important that is in a environment where you're always putting yourself in unsafe positions trying to do things you haven't done before, or maybe it's you got a back niggle and you're worried about it. There is a sense of I'm taking a micro risk every time I go out and play because of this back thing. But I'll just say the other 2 types of support that we're after, the other one is instrumental support, somebody who would lend you several $1,000s without blinking an eye. You know that there's somebody behind you. For me, it was my dad who always would kind of bail me out if I ever needed it. And I know that's a luxury, right? Not everybody has that. Um, but the third one is do you have somebody in your life who tells truth to power, who gives it to you straight, who tells you the uncomfortable truth? And as we know in leadership, the higher we go into leadership positions, often less and less do we get people who are actually willing to take us on. Um, all that being said, I love what you said about social support there, and I'm sorry to derail us yet again. This is gonna be the longest interview ever. Um, Taught me now. So you went and did this thing because grit was what you knew and what was your middle name for the last 10 years. Um, do you want to say?
But it wasn't enough. As the title of your book tells us, "Grit was not enough," right?
Well played.
And I needed to balance my life
Yeah.
and didn't know how to do that at the time. But I'd continued my studies. I started to enjoy my academics a little bit for the first time when I was around 20. And unfortunately had the ability to I'd finished my high school by correspondence while I was traveling Europe, and was able to begin university and started to enjoy sports psychology